Well, hello, church. It's been a long time since I have been around Steve Corp, but I met him shortly after I moved to Rochester, Michigan in the winter of 2001. So I'm not sure, sometime in 2002 or so, I met him. And he also came to several of the youth rallies I did as a singer in different groups. But I'd never actually heard him preach. Well, a few months ago, perhaps even a year ago, one of our team members here said, "Have you ever heard Steve preach?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, he's online. You might want to listen." And I ended up listening to, I think, three in a row. Really enjoyed it. Always liked Steve. Always loved his quiet way. Of course, his skill in music, but also his humor. Always enjoyed that. And he had a quiet wisdom about him. And he brought all of that in well in these lessons that he didn't know I'd be listening to later. So, whenever we decided to bring in guests for this Orchard of God's Grace, taking a look at the fruits of the Spirit, Steve was one of the first names we thought of and reached out to him. Well, Steve has just relocated. After 16 and a half years in southern Indiana, he is now back up in southeast Michigan at Clawson at the Heritage Church of Christ. And so we didn't feel like we could pull him away on a Sunday. So we decided, let's try to remote work this together, a sermon. So this is our first time, and Steve is our big experiment. And Steve, I really appreciate you coming and joining us in this. I gave you a list, and you chose joy. So tell me about why you chose joy.
Yeah, joy came to the surface for me pretty quickly because joy does not come to the surface for me very quickly.
Gotcha.
In general, in my life, it's one of the fruits of the spirit that I feel is difficult for me to access on a consistent basis. And my general rule of thumb with preaching is that I tend to preach to myself and hope that it will resonate with others.
Oh,
And so I thought this will be a good entry point for this for me to speak about something that I myself wrestle to feel on a consistent basis. Um, it reminded me actually of a time in my life where I went to give blood, and they told me you can't give blood today because your iron count is too low. So I thought that's never happened to me before. So I talked to my sister a little bit, who's a nurse, and she said, "Well, have you felt tired?" I said, "Well, yes, but I thought that was just life in general that was making me feel tired." She said, this is weird, but have you been chewing ice?" I said, "Yeah, I have been chewing ice more frequently." And she said, "Well, strangely enough, that's a symptom of iron deficiency. It's your body telling you that there's something wrong." And as I think about joy and the issue I have at times of feeling like a joyful person and expressing that and accessing that, I think just like your body tells you that there are some things that need addressed, sometimes our spirits tell us that there's something that needs addressed too. And so I hope that if there are others out there that are going to hear this lesson that struggle to be a person of joy, that this can be something helpful to call us back to that wonderful gift that God has given us, and to exemplify this fruit of the Spirit in a way that will draw others to the Lord and to this way of living.
well, that is fascinating. I didn't know that about chewing ice, so I will watch for that. This you are talking to a lot of folk around the world, many of whom have been hurt. They've been hurt by life, been hurt by marriages, been hurt by churches, been hurt by their own mistakes or by the mistakes of others. And joy can be a difficult thing for us to summon up after our experiences. And we're we're feeling tired, but we're spiritually tired, emotionally tired, and physically tired. The One of the things that has not marked Christians through the ages is their joy. We tend to look at Christians often as judgmental, or as they feel like they have to have a constant state of disapproval going on to show that I disapprove of this going on in the society, I disapprove of this in the culture, I disapprove of this in the church, to show that they are faithful. And I think that that has hurt us to where we're not really sure how to manifest joy as Christians in a way that would be acceptable to Christ. I mean, I don't even think we're really sure what joy is. I think we confuse it with happiness.
Yeah, and I've also experienced people talking about joy as though it's childish and something to be left
Yeah.
in the past, that we somehow reach a point of maturity and even spiritual maturity where we no longer express that childlike joy. And I
Mm.
think that that is really leaving out a huge blessing in our lives when we don't allow ourselves to feel joy and when we cap that joy and mislabel it as some sort of arrival into spiritual maturity. But definitely, I think in reflecting on my own life, I've confused happiness and joy quite often. To me, the difference is an echo of what Jesus teaches pretty often in the New Testament, that we get stuck in temporary thinking when what Jesus calls us to is eternal thinking. And to me, when I am focused on happiness, I'm focused on something that is very temporary, very reactionary. And when I think about the difference between that and joy, joy is more of an intentional mindset to me. It's a choice. I remember when I was a teenager, there was a series of books and videos based on the idea that love is a decision.
I remember
And
those. Yeah,
yeah, and it was excellent. And I believe that joy is a decision too.
I get you. Okay.
It's not just this fickle, haphazard reaction to what's going on in my life. It is an intentional course that is set, that I keep myself pointed to through the power of the Spirit.
Okay, that's very interesting. I remember those books in particular because at that time I was doing counseling back in the late '80s
Mhm.
and through the '90s, and um, that was one of the books that they wanted you to recommend to people. And for most people, it was very, very beneficial. For others, they said this is too hard. You know, we want the emotion as well, and I think joy can have emotion to it. I think there's a difference between childlike and childish, and I think we
Okay.
confuse those. You know, childish can be very cruel. I mean, there's nobody crueler than a small child turned loose. Yet, childlike is delightful. We enjoy the uncontrolled laughter, the joy of playing with a puppy or getting a popsicle. Um, Later on in life, we have to differentiate between happiness and joy, and I do it because of linguistics. Linguistics is something I studied a lot at the undergrad level. Certainly not an expert, but happiness is based upon happenstance, upon what just happened to you or what is happening around you. Therefore, it is very fickle. It's up and down and up and down and up and down. It's like a day that keeps going off rainy and sunny. You know, it's all based upon what's happening there. Whereas joy is more of a long-term plan, and it does create effort. I'm sorry, it requires effort to be joyful, especially when we live in a world that is full of fear mongers.
Yeah.
Our news, our media, our social media, which is more anti-social media, it's all trying to pull us down or to make us afraid or to make us react to. I love watching YouTube videos, but I've gotten to where I will not click on any, even if I like the videos this particular person makes, but I won't click on it if their thumbnail is one of these, startled things because I'm going, no, that's childish. I don't mind childlike. I don't wanna be shocked with number 8 in the list of things you're gonna say. I wanna be informed or entertained. So you have to have your filters on if you're gonna be joyful. I think, in fact, if we spend our life searching for happiness, we can end up with no joy. I think a rule of universe is that if you search for happiness, you don't find it, because you are demanding that the universe present you with a cake at every 5 seconds, that
Mm.
everything is good, that there's never a downside, that there's never a rest, a lull, a plateau, or a piece of quiet. And I believe that if you search for joy, you can find it, but you might find it in very unlikely places. And you might find it's a quieter joy than you had expected, but you can still find joy. Um, I Often people talk about climbing the ladder of success only to find that they've leaned their ladder up against the wrong wall. I've often thought spending your life trying to find happiness is like leaning your ladder on the wrong wall. You really never get up there. And if you do, it's not what you thought it was. There's not a long term joy. Um, What kind of you've talked about you struggle with joy. I do. I've struggled with depression all my life. I've not
Mhm.
made that a secret. I've struggled with faith in my life, and I don't expect that I'm done with that. I think God still has some wrestling planned for me. So I'm interested in how somebody like you that I respect, who has this quiet, thoughtful spirit, who tells me that joy can be difficult. What kind of paths do you lay out or have you found to help you find joy?
I think my kids have been a great reminder of this for me,
How many kids do you
of
have?
that. Oh, I have 2 kids,
Oh,
and they're pretty awesome in my very biased opinion.
they're probably
Maggie,
perfect.
they're great. Maggie is 8 and Lincoln is 11.
Oh,
Um, and like many parents, we started out our parenting journey saying, "We're not gonna be those parents that let our kids fixate on technology."
sure.
And then lo and behold, it was so easy to say, "Just go on your tablets for a
That's
while."
right. Yeah.
And so we're reckoning now with our lax attitude towards technology. And I don't know if you've read The Anxious Generation
I have not.
by Jonathan Haidt, but I've been screaming from the mountaintops because it's a very convicting book about how our minds have been rewired by social media and smartphones.
So if you'll say the name again,
Yes,
this audience is really big into buying the books that are mentioned. So,
excellent.
okay.
It's The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Okay.
Um, and it was staggering to read. And one of the things that it really highlighted was how prone we are as a society addicted to our phones,
Mhm.
how prone we are to need or convince ourselves that we need constant stimulation. And I've noticed this in my kids that we'll be doing one thing, and 10 seconds after it ends, they're on to the next thing. They're ready for more stimulation. And so, to me, the tie-in for that is the reminder that these things that we convince are making us happy often fade so quickly. Um, I think of it as a dry erase board. I don't know if you've ever been a doofus enough like me to accidentally write on one with a Sharpie before, but there was nothing that I could do to get that Sharpie off of there. But a dry erase marker, I mean, you can take your hand or an eraser or a paper towel or whatever, and it just within seconds is gone. And that's kind of how I view a posture of not settling for the temporary hit of happiness, but choosing for something that's more lasting and more eternal, like joy. And it takes a lot of intentionality. Um, Another path that I think is incredibly useful is gratitude. And
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever had a point that someone's made that just stuck with you so much that you can't get it out of your head.
Many
It
times.
keeps
Yeah.
resurfacing. Um, Listening to Brene Brown has done that for me many times. The people listening might know Brene Brown from various TED Talks. She's written various books, short videos. I recommend that if you see Brene Brown's name attached to something, that you consume it.
Okay.
Um, One of the things that was really helpful for me was her research on joy and gratitude. And going into this, I would have assumed that people are expressing gratitude because they're already joyful. So that was the connection to me, is that, well, of course, you're joyful and I'm not. So it's way easier for you to express gratitude than someone who's not joyful. But all of her research showed that the relationship is actually inverted, that consistently, when she interacted with people who were rooted in joy, it was because they expressed gratitude and intentionally pursued being people of gratitude in their lives. So, joy isn't the vehicle for gratitude, but the other way around, which tells me that if I want to access joy more easily in my life, the first step is to be a person of gratitude.
And I'm hearing you, and I appreciate that. I'm wondering, how do we remind ourselves to be grateful? I mean, for example, whenever I would work with people with great stress, I would notice that their shoulders would come up near their ears, and
Mhm.
you'd get them all relaxed, and they would drop down. But after you start talking to them, they start coming back up. And one of the things we had to do was teach them to be aware of their body and to be aware that they were coming under stress. To me, I think I show a lack of gratitude when I'm not paying attention to the good things that I have. I'm allowing the darker things to overshadow. I did an illustration in front of a bunch of folk a couple times where I'd hold up my hand and I would just put a little dot on it, and I'd say, "What do you see?" And by far, people say, "I see a black dot on your hand," and I said, "Well, what about the rest that's not colored?" That that's me. I can walk through the room and I see the black dot, and therefore, I think I would have to be trained to be more grateful by being more aware. Um, I remember sitting for Thanksgiving lunch at the kids' table a few years ago by my youngest grandson here in Tennessee, and he put a bite of something in his mouth, and his shoulder slumped. He went, mm. And I thought, when was the last time I put a bite in my mouth and didn't just think, well, that tastes all right, but actually just went, like, wow, my life has been enriched. Well, I think we can learn a lot from our kids, truthfully. But is this resonating with you, this concept of trying to be more aware? Um,
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm trying to not hyper focus on thinking about the movie What About Bob and the scene where he has dinner over at
wow. Well,
Leo Martin's house.
I wasn't thinking about that till just now. Now,
So maybe we should be a little more like Bob.
well,
Um, but yeah, I agree that it's never a question of if there is something to be thankful for, right? There's always something to be thankful for, even in the darkest, gloomiest seasons of our lives. We have the breath in our lungs. It's more often a case of, am I aware of what there is to be thankful for? Am I attuned to that? I met a gentleman once who suggested this beautiful, simple practice that he said, every morning when I wake up, I just take 60 seconds to just breathe and take in the reality that I'm loved by God. And that's how I begin my day. And I thought, wow, that is beautiful and sacred and something that I should do every morning too.
that would be transformational. That absolutely would be. I think of when I go to Africa, and it's not like I go a lot. I've been once for a couple of weeks and plan to go back, or perhaps go back. What amazes me are two things. One is the stunning poverty, and two are the smiles.
Hmm.
You see smiles on so many faces, and part of me wants to scream, "What are you happy about? How can you be happy?" But they see things to play with. An empty bottle and a stick can keep the kids busy and joyful for quite a while. But I have the same experience when I go see people in hospital and they're undergoing radiation or chemo or they've had surgeries. They've got tubes all over them. And I'll walk in and ask them how they're doing because that's contractually required of human beings to ask that
Yeah.
stupid question. And many of them have looked at me and said they're just so grateful to be alive. And inside, I'm screaming, why? Look where you are. I'm trying to become more teachable so I can become more grateful, so I can become more joyful. And I think being open to be taught by other people's gratitude might be one of those paths we might want to look for.
Yeah, and I think my own sense of entitlement, whether that's in general, like an
That's a good
umbrella, or
point.
in pockets, is a huge obstacle
Yeah.
to being a person of gratitude. If I believe that I have earned or deserve a certain standard of life, and that's a lofty goal, then of course I'm going to end up in a constant state of disappointment when reality does not match my entitled expectations. So a humility of knowing that, you know, the only blessing I need in order to be happy is the presence of God in my life and the breath in my lungs. That really changes the standard for what will bring out that gratitude and removes that obstacle of entitlement.
Well, I think while we're there, we've been using an orchard as a metaphor for this series. And I've been in a lot of orchards in my life. And to me, it looks to be one of the most labor intensive ways to make a living. because everything on the planet wants to hurt your tree and your fruit. So there are two things you have to do, though. If you focus on getting rid of the pest, insects, dealing with weather, and the like, that doesn't mean your tree's going to be healthy. You also have to pay attention to the tree. So we have to feed our ability to be joyful, but we also have to watch out for the insects. And one of them would be discontentment, or that feeling of privilege. Another might be trust in ourselves, as if we could create our own joy. I think we can decide to be joyful, but we might have to look outside of ourselves and see a bigger picture. As you mentioned a while ago, you were talking about this is more of a long-term view than happiness. And I think trust in self might get in the way of that. So I'll let you comment if you'd like, but I think that little 60-second thing, they say practice makes perfect. I think we have to practice joy, but also watch out for those insects, those things, the weeds that choke the tree. In one of your lessons, you gave us a path to lead us to joy, even when joy is very, very difficult to find. Um, and that whole idea was finding joy in what is to come. And so I'd just like for you to elaborate on that for our folk.
Yeah, in thinking about looking ahead and not being fixated on what's right in front of me, I flashed back to a time as a teenager that I wanted to go to a baseball game. And I didn't know much about the whole process. So I bought these tickets, and man, they seemed like a great deal for some reason. All the tickets around them were more expensive. And I thought, man, I'm really pulling the wool over Ticketmaster's eyes here, you know. And I get there, and it's an obstructed view. And so I got a wonderful, cheap view of a concrete pillar in front of me for the entire game. And then it made sense.
Sure.
And it's really hard to enjoy what's going on the field when all you can fixate on is that concrete pillar in front of you. And I think that that's what I do often with this life is that the pain, the hurt, the inconveniences, the people that drive in ways that I would prefer they not drive, all of these big and small things become that concrete pillar that's in front of me. And I can't seem to peek around it at the joy that is to come. And I'm going to make a really bold and possibly controversial statement here that
This
as
is the
followers,
this is the
as
place.
followers of Jesus, perhaps we should look to the example of Jesus.
There you wow.
I know that's mind blowing.
Wow.
And I hope your church doesn't get shut down for
We
something
can
that
cut this
bold being
we
stated.
can cut this part out and edit. Go ahead.
Yeah, probably do. And that's why I love the book of Hebrews
Oh, I love it.
because it calls us back to that idea that we can often get fixated on what's temporary and forget what is coming. Um, in chapter 11, it calls specifically to the example of Abraham and Sarah. Um, and it reminds me that I'm guilty sometimes of being a little bit condescending and judgmental when I read scripture because we journey through Abraham and Sarah's story, and God makes them this promise that seems improbable, but God promised. And so sometimes I read their story and I think, now, how could you have this whole thing with Hagar over here?
Mm-hmm.
How could you lie about who Sarah was? How could you have these doubts? God came to you directly and promised. And then I realized that what takes me a couple seconds to turn pages from chapter to chapter was 25 years of waiting. And so I understand how there were times where Abraham and Sarah were a little impatient, where they felt like they might need to help God along, which is a mistake that I make sometimes too, and how they maybe wavered in waiting for this promise to come to fruition. But as God always does, God was faithful to the promise that was made. And in order to get through those times of impatience, they had to set their eyes on the promise that was made and have hope that God would be faithful. And I think that lesson is there for us as well. Because then the author of Hebrews goes on in chapter 12 in a really well known passage to remind us of this great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us and encourages us to fix our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross.
Oh, okay.
And so it's because of what Jesus trusted was on the horizon that he could endure this. It's because of what Abraham and Sarah trusted was the promise to come that they could endure these impatient times of the testing of their faith. And again, I think it's true for us too that's our call as believers in God's promises, as people who trust in the example of Jesus and seek to live as Jesus lived, that we too are called to endure these temporary moments that can sometimes feel like that pillar in front of us. We're to trust in those times that there is something greater that lies ahead because of the faithfulness of God.
I love it. I love it. There are some passages that come to mind that really challenge me. James 1:2, count it all joy, when you fall into persecution and face trials, because it does produce something. Um, that pillar in front of us can be our cultural or our worldview that it tends to say the good old days are gone. I wish my grandkids could live in as free, run outside and play all night that I did, or something such as this. But for a Christian like Abraham and Sarah, the best is yet to come. Uh, Things are going to get better. And I think that's hard to remind ourselves of that because the world keeps saying it's getting worse. It's getting
Mhm.
worse. When God keeps saying it's going to get better and it's going to be so much better. You're not going to believe how much better this is. It's going to be great for you. Um, I think of Habakkuk chapter 3. I've always loved Habakkuk, a little book, but it starts off with a complaint to God about, why aren't you helping us? We've been doing all this sacrificing and praying. Why aren't you helping? And that's my prayer a lot to God is, well, God, to be honest, if I were you, I would have done this different. I would have acted sooner or I would have done this. And God doesn't get angry at this at all. He just comes back and he goes, well, consider these things. Now understand that this has to happen. And Habakkuk at the end says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. You mentioned a book that had a great impact on you. Every few years, I go back and read. It's a short book. It's just 100 some pages. Viktor Frankl's book, A Man's Search for Meaning. And he was eminent psychiatrist at University of Vienna, professor, but he was Jewish. The Nazis came, put him and his family into concentration camps. His family all died. They all perished. He, as a psychiatrist, was a man of science, and he was a man who noticed things. And he noticed that a lot of people died as soon as they were brought to the concentration camp and put in the labor fields. They weren't put in the gas chambers. They were put out to work, but they died quickly, while others lived for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And he decided to study the people who lived rather than sitting around angry at the people for the people who died. And he found that the ones who lived chose their focus. Instead of this piece of bread is old, crusty, and I used to eat well, they would be happy they had the crust of bread. The Christians in the camp would take the crust of bread and some mucky water, and that would be their communion that they would celebrate. He saw one puddle where people were drinking from, and it was so full of contaminants that there were rainbows on it, reflecting back the dirt and the oil. And he asked them, how could they be joyful to drink out of this? And one of the Jewish men looked at him and said, I'm drinking a rainbow. It was the focus that gave everything meaning that allowed them to have joy. And I think focusing on joy is something you and I have both admitted that we have to work on. It is not a natural thing for us, but things are going to get better. Faith, hope, and love. That's all we've got, and love is greater than all the rest. I've talked a lot, but you're my guest. I'd like for you to close us out with any thoughts that you would like to add to the end um, that you didn't get to express. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm just overwhelmed by that example. of in that extreme state of suffering to be able to have that
Yeah,
perspective.
me too. Yeah.
That's inspiring and challenging to me. It makes my little flare-ups I have in traffic seem very insignificant in comparison.
Mhm.
Um, it may seem oversimplified, but the idea I have to close us out is that I want to be a person of joy. That's what I want. That's what I desire. And so often, I think another obstacle for me can be focusing on how I haven't been a person of joy and getting fixated on the negative side of that instead of the aspiration of desiring to be a person of joy. And for me, I am very quickly reminded that when people around me experience the fruit that my efforts have produced, it is incredibly underwhelming. But when people experience the fruit that the Spirit produces in me and through me and in spite of me, people are drawn to that and inspired by that and pointed to God because of that. And so I was thinking about this clip that I saw, I think one of the few good things maybe to come out of TikTok, where a preacher said, you know, when a tree is planted, the fruit isn't for the tree, the fruit is for the people that experience the tree. And while this will definitely be a benefit to us to embody the fruits of the Spirit, it's also for the people that we encounter. Um, with all apologies to Dionne Warwick, I do agree that what the world needs now is love, but I look at a world that is devoid of joy. And I pray that we as Christians can be vessels for the joy of the Lord. And that happens not through our efforts, but through giving ourselves over to the work of the Spirit within us.
That's
So
brilliant.
my prayer is, may that be so.
That's brilliant. And I'm going to add an addendum here just for people who are watching this and they see you and I here together, even though remote. Neither Steve nor I bounce around the stage with happy, happy, joy, joy faces. There are times my wife will say, "Are you happy?" And I'll say, "Yes." And she'll say, "Well, you should tell your face." Because my resting face is that, you know, the thoughtful scowl or whatever. Uh, we don't have to put on fake faces. We don't have to put on fake happiness. We can be who we are. You can be introvert or extrovert. You can be quiet or you can be a bit louder, but not that loud. You can be expressive or contemplative, and you can be a person of joy. It might be a very quiet joy, but there are people out there that need to meet with somebody who has quiet joy to ease them in peacefully. And you're one of those people, and I'm grateful to have you in my life. My life is better because I know you. And I'm really happy for you and your family, your new move and your new work. And I pray that you prosper, pray that you thrive, and I pray it brings you great joy because I know you're going to bring joy to others. God bless you, brother.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
God bless you.